So on the subject of the cost of living, the House of Representatives Economics Committee has an inquiry underway about competition and dynamism in key sectors, including supermarkets, the tech sector and the domestic airline industry. That inquiry has heard from big supermarket chains, including Coles, Woolworths and Metcash, and from the former Productivity Commissioner, Peter Harris, who's reviewed demand and use at Australia's biggest airport, Sydney Airport. The chair of the Economics Committee is Dr Dan Molina, who I should also say is a former economics lecturer at Monash University. So with that hat on, Dan, we should ask you about inflation. I mean, this is obviously welcome that the inflation is coming down. The question is whether it's coming fast enough down for the government and indeed for Australian households.
Oh, hi, Ross. Thanks for the opportunity. You're right. Today's numbers were very welcome. Look, I should acknowledge that there are a lot of people, of course, doing it very tough out in the community. When I talk to people in my electorate, there are a lot of people who are finding cost of living a real challenge. But having said that, when you see monthly inflation having come down from 8.4% in the December month reading of last year to 5.4% in the last reading, and the quarterly figures coming down, as you've just noted, that we're seeing a trajectory that is heading down in a very welcome way. Now, of course, there's a ways to go before we get to the 2 to 3% band that we all want to see inflation in, but it's very welcome to see inflation on this trajectory.
Just one thing about this, and just explain this in the way that you're a lecturer, you'd explain it to students. The reality is, even though inflation might be coming down, the truth is that Australian families, Australian businesses are still having to bear higher costs. Inflation can go to zero now, but therefore the prices are still still much, much higher than where they were 2 years ago.
Right, that's true. But, what we want to see over time is that people's incomes rise to the point where they're seeing real wages growth as we see inflation come down. And what we're seeing at the moment is inflation coming down. As I mentioned, it's come from 8.4 on the December 22 reading to 5.4. That's 3 percentage points lower. We're seeing real wages increase, nominal wages increase, but in a sustained and measured way. So we went to the last election arguing for an increase in the minimum wage of $1 an hour. The government at the time didn't support that, but that's provided some real support for those who are most vulnerable. And what we're hoping to see is that wages across the board continue to increase, and that real wages increase in the not too distant future.
All right, let's move to the work of the committee, the Economics Committee, and this inquiry into the dynamism and competition in these key areas, and in particular supermarkets, because that's one area, if there is a lack of competition, then there's a lack of price pressure to prevent profits and therefore prices being pushed higher. What are you seeing inside the committee?
So, look, I should say that we've only just started looking at this sector, and it's a complicated sector. But we heard evidence from Woolworths and Coles yesterday. We also heard from Metcash, which gave us insights from the independent growers. So, first and foremost, look, we've started to seek evidence from the big chains in particular as to their margins, their EBITDA and their profit rates over the last decade or so. What we're really interested in looking at is how have those profit margins changed over time. So, for example, did the entry of Aldi do anything to those profit margins? And what have those profit margins look like post-COVID? So we've really only just started to seek that evidence. We'll receive that evidence in a few weeks, and I think that will be very insightful. What we want to see is that supermarkets are not raising prices above and beyond the input price increases that they're experiencing. The other thing I'd say is that we received what I thought was really interesting evidence when it came to some of the upstream providers, so a lot of the providers of food, some of the manufactured foodstuffs. So there's real issues when you have market concentration at the supermarket level in terms of uneven bargaining processes, potentially. And so those were really interesting perspectives that were added by the National Farmers Federation and the Australian food and grocery industry. So those were perspectives that we'll also add in. And finally, I would just add that we received some interesting evidence from from the independent grocers. And when you go to regional areas, there are some regional centres where they only have an independent grocer providing supermarket services. So, they were some issues that had arisen when the big four banks gave evidence, and also a lot of the regional banks. I think there's a range of interesting issues in relation to the provision of supermarket services to regional communities that we need to think through as well.
OK, just one thing I want to go to, and that is Australia's known as the land of the great duopoly. 2, maybe 3 competing in any one industry. Airports, airlines are one other area as well. Peter Harris, the former Productivity Commissioner, gave evidence about this. The notion of slot farming, that they farm these slots to prevent competition coming in, does that worry you?
Well, I think he gave very interesting evidence, and he'd written a report on this, of course. So Peter Harris is a former chair of the Productivity Commission, as you note. He wrote a report a couple of years ago, has extensive experience in aviation. And what he said was, on a few fronts, we need to, I think, have a close look at the way that, for example, the morning peak slots at Sydney Airport in particular are allocated. So I think that he would make the argument that the way they're currently allocated is skewed against new entrants, that it's too easy for incumbents to retain their slots, even if they're cancelling quite a high proportion of flights, and that there isn't sufficient monitoring. So he talked about the need to invest more in the auditing, or the monitoring of the way in which those slots are being managed. Are cancellations being done cynically or due to other factors? So I think a lot of those things do need to be looked at.
Yes, indeed. Daniel Molino, good to have you on the program. We'll do it again shortly. Many thanks for your time.